on range management, both native ranges and planted, doing a lot of research on annual forages, and I think that's going to be the topic of your presentation today, right?
That's all right. That's right. Thank you. Well, yeah, this annual forages, we can talk about both cool season annuals as well as warm seasons. And I think over the last number of years, whether it's been, dry or in a drought situation or more normal years, that there's been quite a bit of interest in some of these for some of the livestock producers that may have some more marginal cropland where they find that growing some of these annual forages can certainly help out with some of their feed needs, whether it be extra hay or extra grazing. And when I cover these annual forages, I like to kind of go through the season of the year that they're typically planted. So for the cool season, we have mostly the spring cereal grains like oats or spring triticale, spring barley, some field peas, and I think by far, of course, oats is probably one of the more common ones that people are planting for extra hay or, in a lot of cases, grazing. So with the cool seasons, we can be looking at planting dates as far as early as mid-March, or really cool soil temperatures in that 43 to 45 degree range, which in a lot of areas in mid-March you'll see that. So if you go much later than in mid-April in terms of planting, the heat's going to get you and you're just not going to get the production from them. Depending on the crop you had before, might check if you did have any residual herbicides or whatever crop was planted the previous years, because a lot of these are pretty sensitive to some residual herbicides. Seeding rates, I'll talk a little bit more about that in general, but on fertilization, nitrogen is the primary one need, and of course everybody in Extension talks about do a soil test to thoroughly determine what your exact nutrient requirements are going to be, but with the small grains, typically 50 to 70 pounds of nitrogen, whether it's irrigated or not, is typically a general requirement or need. On that seeding rate, we did some trials a few years ago at some different locations in Nebraska. HPAL is over by Sydney, High Plains Ag Lab. NP is North Platte, and then Lincoln in eastern Nebraska. But we had 4 different seeding rates of oats, either 25, 50, 75, or 100 pounds per acre. And typically when you talk to people, they'll say, well, plant your oats 2 or 3 bushels per acre. So that oats is maybe anywhere from 36 to 40 pounds per bushel. So that's 100 to 120 pounds of oats planted per acre. And we went all the way down to 25 as our lowest rate. But what we found is on the average of all the sites that at 50, 75, or 100 pounds per acre, we had no difference in our forage yield, all right? So take-home message is you can probably get by with a lot less seed and still end up with just as much forage, okay? I hope there's no seed dealers in here, but... and at 25 pounds per acre, which seems pretty light, even then the yield was pretty respectable. And we also did some fertilizer with that. We had either 0, 30, or 60 pounds of nitrogen. Let's see if I get this pointer to work here. Not sure. But here we did see a response, yes. Looking at the average or mean of those 3, that we did get a response, the highest yield with the 60 pounds of nitrogen compared to no nitrogen at all. So definitely that 60 pounds or so is a recommendation on that. Here's just some photos of some things we planted in late March in 2015. Forage quality of these oats and spring cereal grains, and just remembering right off the top of my head, we're anywhere from 8 to 10% in terms of crude protein of these spring annuals. For the warm season or summer annuals, we've got several options or choices here. We've got the millets, either the grazing type would be like pearl millet, or the hay types, which would be the foxtail or Siberian, white wonder. There's sorghum Sudan grass hybrids, straight sorghum Sudan grass. Even done some things with crabgrass or teff, some corn, and several other legumes as a possibility. For those, need those warmer soil temperatures. And we can have a pretty wide window of planting. I'll show you some things here where we planted some of these warm season annuals where we had some moisture, planted them as early or as late as the first part of August, and still got pretty respectable yields. Again, with those two, some nitrogen is going to be the primary need. If we are irrigated, certainly that higher end can certainly pay off to get the most of that higher amounts of nitrogen fertilizer. Typical yields of these, you know, for those tall growing sorghums and sorghum Sudan grass hybrids and so on, anywhere from 4 to 5 tons per acre. The foxtail millets or the shorter growing ones, you know, that 2.5 to 3.5. Here's one of the examples where we did some different planting dates on. Here on the left being a teff, in the middle being a white wonder foxtail millet, and then a sorghum Sudan grass hybrid. We planted July 11th, and this is at the end of August, or just shows the amount of growth you can see with only 48 days of growing. And this was irrigated. Then here was a late July planting and a September 13th photo. So again, 48 days, but again, very, very productive in terms of the amount of yield that we saw. And this was the actual yield numbers. Over 4 tons for the sorghum Sudan hybrid and about 2.5 for the teff and foxtail millet. And on that late July planting, again, almost 4 and almost 3 or 2.5 to 3 tons for those others. Another option for some people can be planting some things in the late summer or midsummer with the idea of looking for some fall forage. And again, those things that we might plant in the spring, I think work pretty well. The oats, barley, spring triticales, or some of those other things we might see in cover crops, but planting late July through August. Or then, of course, your traditional winter grains like the winter wheat, winter rye, or winter triticale, where you're planting in late August to September, but it's mostly forage you're going to have is going to come in the following spring. Here's some examples of those. We planted these different things on August 13th. This was irrigated. It's 2012. We had some spring triticale, some oats and a barley, and a few other things in there. Harvested on October 29th after frost. And I guess, of course, with these cool seasons in the fall, you're going to be having frost by that time of year, but their freeze down is pretty slow. So they were still certainly green. And again, with these, over 3 to 4 tons in terms of dry matter forage yield from those. Another example here of from central Nebraska, or maybe more eastern Nebraska, was an oats and turnip mix planted in late summer and being grazed here as up to November 1st, or in November 1st. And again, with those cool seasons in the fall, they typically freeze down in late November to mid-December. You got to have about 15 degrees or so or lower before they really basically, you know, die or turn brown. We've done some things with planting into wheat residue after wheat harvest, you know, in the middle of July there. And on dry land situations, is probably only like 1 out of every 3 or 4 years where you've got enough moisture to really make it to grow anything. One year we did do it, and we did have an unusually high amount of rain in August, and that allowed us to get some pretty good production from this kind of a cover crop mix seeded into wheat stubble. We've done some things by mixing the winter hardy and non-winter hardy things, and so by that I mean mixing a combination of winter rye and oats, or rye and turnips. And of course, with that first one, the rye and oats, this is a late summer planting. The oats is going to grow much better in the fall and get more growth out of it. But of course, the oats is going to die out over the winter. But you've got the rye there for the following spring. So it's kind of getting both some fall and spring grazing with a one planting operation. Just some photos. This is rye and turnips in the end of September, looking pretty good there. Rye and oats in early October. So, you know, most of what we're seeing is the oats because that rye is in there, but it's just not that big at that time of year yet. Yeah, planting date's really important. In the foreground here is things we planted on August 13th, and then in the background is September 21st. The photo was taken October 8th, and you can see that that's September 21st planting. It's just too late. You're not going to have much in the way of fall forage from that. And so as a rule of thumb, we go by September 1st as if we're planting anything cool season. And then for a warm season, again, like a cane or Sudan grass, I think even up to August 10th, you can go and have a late planting like that and get some pretty significant fall forage. With some of those annuals, particularly the warm seasons, like as a sorghum Sudan grass hybrid, grazing them can be a bit of a challenge. You know, you see probably the biggest mistake a lot of people make is letting them get too tall before they turn in. And then cattle go in there, they end up stripping off a lot of the leaves and trampling. Wasting a lot is really what it boils down to. And of course, it just makes sense that grazing isn't as efficient is not as efficient as haying. And I think so really starting at the appropriate stage or height. So if you have something like Sudan grass, you know, I think, you know, if it gets 20 inches tall, you better start getting out there or turn out on it and get those cattle grazing on it because, you know, sometimes with those, it seems in a week's time, it can go from 20 inches tall to 3 feet tall, you know, in no time at all. We have some, because I had a lot of questions of people about grazing some of these different things rather than the haying. We did come up with some kind of estimates, and they always ask, well, if I'm growing some oats in the spring, how many cattle can I graze on it? You know, what's going to be the stocking? And I think this is pretty representative. So if we think we can grow 3.5 tons of oats if it were hay, okay, for that means that if we convert it into grazing using a certain type of, or a certain level of grazing efficiency, we call it, but that should hold you about two pairs for a month and a half, okay, which typically would be, say, late May through early July. That's six-week period, two cow-calf pairs per acre. This one would be for some of the warm season annuals, your Sudan or pearl millets and so on. And again, I give a choice of potential hay yields, and we might just use 4 tons per acre again. And with that means, which we could typically, or potentially I should say, graze for 3 months. So if we planted that in late May or early June, by mid-July, mid-August, and maybe 2 months is more realistic. But there again, almost a pair and a third, a pair and a half per acre for 2 months is what that should support if it were grazed. And again, for the midsummer or late summer planted cool season annuals, it's also very similar. Say if we got 3.5 tons, if it were going to be hayed, that means for a 2-month grazing in the fall, probably about a pair and a half per acre should be where that carrying capacity or stocking would be. Under irrigation, yeah, we've done some things too where we could look at some double cropping, of course, combining both a spring, not combining, but using a spring planted annual. Of course, again, there, like planted in late March, something like oats. Then your warm season planted in late May would have a growth pattern like this. And then a midsummer or late summer planting, say in mid to late July, you would have a fall growth period like that. And we put together some different examples of how you might use both cool and warm seasons under irrigation have a situation where you always had some forage ready to be grazed. So like in the first example here, in the first field, field 1, we might have had something like rye planted the previous fall. Well, you can be grazing that beginning in mid-April through May. After that's grazed out in that field, you plant a warm season annual, like say Sudan grass, graze that, the rest of the summer. And then in the next field or another field, you'd have a spring, something like oats planted. That's ready to graze in later May to early July. And so you can see how you'd be here in field 1 grazing that, go to field 2, field 3, and so on. So just some examples. And these slides are in your handouts too if you wanted to have a closer look. This is just another one of a possible plan that has some other possibilities in there using 3 different fields that could be kind of incorporated in this double cropped annual forage type of system. Some other things that we've done work with and some people have tried fairly successfully is, excuse me, so what we call either stockpile grazing, growing these forages in the summer, letting them stand and then come back in the late fall and winter and directly graze those, or the windrow grazing. I think this is some foxtail millet in late August or early September that's been swathed and cut, and it's just going to stay there. It's not going to be baled, but cattle will be turned in and in the late fall or winter, and those cattle will directly graze those windrows. Typically, when you're doing that windrow grazing, you're not going to let them have the whole thing. You're going to use some temporary electric fencing to kind of allocate or partition out those windrows so they clean them up better. Talked about earlier the freeze down on those cool season annuals in the fall. Mary Durnowski at UNL, she did some work where she had oats and turnips, and they looked at their quality in both November and December. And in one of the years, they had a situation where it got cold, really cold the 1st of November, like those 10 to 15 degree days. And so oats, turnips, they're going to freeze down and look like this in late November when it's that cold. But what she did see, surprisingly, and they really picked this up off the ground well, and the quality was still in there, even though it had froze and laid down like that. Again, I think I already mentioned this about the mixes into wheat residue. Dry land doesn't work very well, but under irrigation it does pretty good. This was a wheat field harvested, and oats were planted in late July after wheat harvest, of course, and he had a mixture of both volunteer wheat and the new oats coming on. And this was an interesting system here. He was allocating the grazing with an electric fence hooked onto his center pivot, and then whenever he wanted to give or allocate more feed to the cattle, you just move the pivot ahead a few degrees on there. Out of Colorado came some work about different annual interseeded into standing corn, and then in the fall they came in and looked what was out there. So the corn stalk residue, was the bulk of it. They tried some different things. Annual ryegrasses, they got a bit of it in there. Annual ryegrass and crimson clover was pretty good. Brassica mix also worked fairly well, producing about 700 pounds per acre in with that corn stalk residue. When we talk about annuals, we've got to talk always a little bit about nitrates. And this kind of grouping here, I got either high, medium, and that means just their, I guess, overall general potential to accumulate nitrates. We could talk about weeds too, your pig weeds and stuff like that, which, yeah, if they're Russian thistle, they can. But in general, the warm season annuals, they have a higher likelihood of accumulating nitrates compared to some of the cereal grains. The brassicas and turnips and so on are more in the medium category. One of the things this year, I saw something from Ward Labs in Kearney. one of their consultants or people had written a quick article about the samples they got in last year at Ward Labs. So it was like over 300 samples came into Ward Labs for specific testing of nitrates. And of those 300, she said about 38% of those came back at a high level of nitrates. And, you know, that may seem like a lot, but the reason people sent them in, they suspected there might be some high nitrates in there. And of course, with nitrates in any of these annual forages, yeah, you know, some of the key things why too much nitrogen in the soil, those weather cases, of course, like drought, sometimes herbicides, sometimes diseases. And you have to keep in mind when you're looking at a nitrate report from a lab, that can be done in 3 different ways. Most labs, I think, use this nitrate nitrogen. And that shows if you have 2,100 parts per million or more, that's a toxic level. There's some other ways they do nitrates shown here, and so they have their own different potential toxic amounts. And just an example of a from Ward Labs a long time ago we did that shows 2 different forages here. These were swarm season annuals, but one of them was 2,200 parts per million nitrates, and that we classified as toxic. Another one here at 468, which would be safe. Did some work with drought-stressed corn with some producers last year that had, of course, dryland corn that wasn't going to make any grain. You know, it's late July, August, starting to look like this. It's, you know, wanting to salvage it. And, you know, one of the guys, you know, of course, they talked about silaging it, but just too expensive to silage just for the amount of yield that you get. That silage can be pretty expensive. You've got to hire somebody in to do that. A long time ago, or actually this is from 2012, I took some corn plant samples. This is drought-stressed corn. And we sectioned off that stalk at every 6 inches. So from 0 to 6, 6 to 12, so on, all the way up to 36 to 60 inches, or so it was 5-foot tall corn. Then we also separated the leaves and the husks. And then we did a nitrate test on them. And as you can see, in the lower stems of that corn stalk, the nitrates were definitely the highest. You know, if they would only graze leaf and husk of that dried up corn, they'd be just fine. And I did some last year too with a field of both dryland corn and milo by North Platte there. And for the corn, we separated whole plants, but we did 0 to 12 inches, 12 to 24, and 24 to 36. So the corn on average is only about 3 feet tall. And yeah, that lower stem was pretty high in nitrates, over 7,000, even that 12 to 24 inches. That's not toxic, but that's still pretty high. But what was interesting was the really good crude protein and good TDN. This one guy's place I did it at, he happened to live right by the highway, and he had a big field of dryland corn. He ended up haying it and stacked up all the bales right by the highway. He said, boy, I never got so many calls in my life of people wanting to buy that. Milo, too, over by Grant. We had some that made it up to 3 feet tall, and this was, August 4th we sampled. Again with the Milo, 0 to 8 inches, really high, 8 to 16 inches and above, not so bad in terms of the nitrates. But again, pretty good feed, good crude protein levels in that. Last thing, whoops. I was going to point out there, that was 22, but it reminds me of the story early last spring, I was talking to a rancher friend of mine. It was back in March or April, and he was planning for the upcoming grazing season, the 2022 grazing season, and he said he was kind of worried about what was going to happen in 2022, and he said, I asked him why, and he said, well, the year ends in a 2. He said, if you think back, there's 2022, 2012, 2002, we're all pretty severe drought years, so. With that, I'm sure we have some time for questions. Sandy?
You mentioned your lower seeding rate with the oats. How was the weed pressure
Oh, yeah, that's certainly a good point there. A question is about how, at a lower seeding rate, with with the oats in the trial we did, yeah, you're gonna, at first you're gonna leave a little more open space in there, potential space for weeds to grow. And I think at my North Platte site it didn't cause a problem, but at the Lincoln site, they did get quite a few more weeds, showing up in that at that lower seeding rate. And it was interesting too. Um, and, the thing you got to keep in mind too is, particularly if you're grazing that oats, that maybe those little bit higher seeding rates are better, because with oats, when it's grazed there in May, you've got all these individual plants there, and when they're grazed, that can stimulate them to tiller, or in other words, shoot up more shoots, just like wheat or rye does in the spring. And at a bit higher seeding rate, you've got more plants in there with the potential to do it. But in our case, where we hate it, like I said, the yield at just 50 pounds, which is a little over a bushel per acre, was still really good, as equal to the higher seeding rates. And those plants at the lighter seeding rate, it was interesting there. They were actually higher in quality. I don't think I showed the crude protein content of that forage, but the lighter seeding rate, crude protein content was higher, and they're likely because those fewer plants were able to capture more of the nitrogen in the soil, which in turn converted it to protein.
We did the same trial.
Yep.
At our Hayes location, and at our location, the 25 pounds was less than the others. It plateaued out at the 50.
Yeah.
50, 70, 500 was all the same as far as.
Yep.
I saw you used a direct grazing efficiency value of like 40%.
Mm-hmm.
I assume that's kind of a nominal value.
Yeah.
Do you see an increase in efficiency for windrow grazing?
Oh, yes, we did years ago one windrow grazing study, and in our study there, we allocated about a week's worth of forage. So in every week we moved our temporary fence forward, and we measured waste at the end of that out of those windrows, and we were at about 20 to 25% waste. So that means 70, 75 or so percent was consumed by the animal, which is good. Anything else?
Have you done any studies on the reduction of nitrogen with the ensiling process?
A reduction of nitrates in the silage? No, not specifically, but in general, when you ensile something, and at least it's a month in the bunker or pit, you reduce nitrates by about 50%, by about half. And those nitrates are tricky. Rick Funson, he's our physiologist at North Platte, and he was desperate for hay this year, and he did buy some Sudan grass hay. And person he bought it from, I think over by Paxton or something, it was up, had it tested. Yeah, it was about 3,000 parts per million nitrates, which is hot. And so, but Rick, he was mixing it. I think he only put 10% in a mixer truck, 10% of that hot stuff in there. And in his case, boy, he still did have like 3 or 4 heifers abort, and maybe just a hot spot or something in there. But yeah, it's nothing to mess around with, if you lose a few calves. Worst case I'd seen on that was with the nitrates was the guy that had some corn that was irrigated corn that was hailed out in July. They came back in after the hailed out corn and planted a kind of a cover crop mix, and then didn't go in there, turn cattle out till November or December, and boy, aborted a bunch of calves with high nitrates in that frozen down or standing, because once the nitrates are in there, they're slow to leave that plant. So, anything else? Well, I'll be here throughout today, so if you've got other questions, feel free. Yep.